Now let's analyze how our views about brain function and the nervous system have changed over time before we move on to talking about different kinds of research methods that we use today. Trepanation, which was used around 5000 before current era, or BCE, was an ancient procedure that people thought could bring the dead back to life. Now, it used to be that we believed that this was a procedure that people would use to release evil spirits. In fact, our understanding of it has changed. Nowadays, we believe that ancient peoples used it as a way to bring people back to life, and in fact, in some cases, it may have actually worked. If your brain was starting to swell because of damage or because of meningitis or some other infection, releasing that pressure by making an open area in the skull would have allowed those individuals to potentially survive some of that infection and brain swelling. We have no idea how successful it was, but definitely early peoples had a much more advanced view of the brain than we originally believed. About 3000 BCE, the Egyptians believed that the soul of an individual was held inside the heart and that the brain was less critical. They viewed the brain as being a radiator for heat, which it does, but in fact, some writings suggest that they viewed the heart as being more critical. And that makes sense, because even small amounts of damage, a small nick to the heart, will lead it to stop functioning, and if your heart stops working, then your brain will soon after there die. But you can actually take large amounts of damage to the brain and still be able to function. We've been able to remove large sections of cortical tissue, that wrinkly surface of the brain, from animals and still see that they can function pretty well. They at least have some survivability. But in fact, some of the ancient Egyptians' observations did suggest that they understood that brain damage was linked to paralysis and that they understood that the brain was important in motor function. Moving forward, Galen of Pergamon proposed the idea that the brain served as an important sensory, motor, and cognitive function. He falsely believed, though, that the brain was a muscle that would push fluid to different nerve fibers in the peripheral nervous system, kind of like your heart pushes blood to all of your blood vessels and capillaries around your body. Okay? Nowadays, it took thousands of years for us to, almost 2,000 years for us to change that view, but we now understand that nerve fibers, as we'll talk about, don't actually come in physical contact with one another, and that they send nerve impulses or electrical signals down the inside of a cell before they convert that electrical signal into a chemical signal that then floats across a synaptic cleft or a space that then goes to other nearby neurons. So that's a very different way of functioning than your cardiovascular system works. Around the Renaissance, though, René Descartes proposed that your soul was separate from your physical body. We call this idea dualism. This mind-body dualism was the idea that your soul or your mind existed outside of your physical body, and that you actually couldn't study it. So for Descartes, the French philosopher, he believed that your soul floated somewhere in the ether above you or outside of your body, and that your soul would send signals through an area called the pineal gland, deep in the center of your brain, that your pineal gland was like an antenna that received signals from your soul. And that in fact it made no sense to try to study the human mind or the soul. That actually differs from today, because nowadays what we view is the idea of monism, that in fact the mind is a result of brain activity, and that by understanding brain activity and the chemicals and signals that are released inside the brain, we can also understand the mind, or what people think, feel, and how they behave. The problem, though, is that the legacy of dualism, right? People still, even today, the general public still sort of has this inherent idea about dualism. People really find it difficult to imagine that complex mental processes, altruism, love, could be the result of neurons, right? That how does electrical signals and chemical signals make someone experience lifelong attachment and love? Remember we talked about TD monkeys, and those TD monkeys, right, that pair bond with one another, they don't have a mind, they don't have a complex soul, I would guess, but yet they seem to be able to form these long-term pair bonds. They don't look exactly like human pair bonding, but it does share some commonality with it. And in fact, regulating or controlling the neurochemicals associated with that, like oxytocin and prolactin, does alter pair bonding TD monkeys as it does in humans. But think about that, right? That really, we do have lots of evidence, as we'll come back to, that complex mental processes can be the result of neuronal firing of brain tissue. But that then leads us to starting to talk about consciousness, right? So we're going to consider that humans and TD monkeys share this sort of long-term pair bonding behavior. What else do they share in common, right? So are humans conscious? Are they aware of what's going on around them? Are you aware of what's going on around you? If so, how do you know that, right? And I would guess that I don't have to convince you that you're conscious and that you have an experience of consciousness. But do TD monkeys, are they consciously aware? Do they know that they're pair bonded with another individual? And what does that look like? If so, if some organisms have consciousness and others don't, or some have more advanced forms of consciousness, where does that come from? What parts of the brain is that related to? And does that mean that humans have a larger area of this brain than TD monkeys or rhesus macaques? Does your dog have conscious experience? Does your cat have conscious experience? And then, equally controversial, at what point does a human embryo begin to experience consciousness like an adult human does? At what point does a child begin to experience consciousness like an adult human does? These are some of the complications that we're still working through as a field. As we moved forward historically, it was Galvani that identified that, in fact, electricity was important in neural communication, that by running electrical currents through the muscle tissue of frogs, he was able to identify that, in fact, it's electrical signaling that plays an important role in neural communication, in this case of muscle movement, but in fact what we found is that electrical signaling is important in all kinds of neural communication. And then in 1809, we started to understand that different parts of the brain could do different things. Franz Gall suggested the idea of phonology. Phonology is this idea that different parts of your brain and the surface of your skull is related to those brain areas. So if you had a bump on one area of the brain, as you can see in this small diagram, that meant a larger brain area, and that was related to being more generous or more friendly or more greedy or more altruistic. So Franz Gall's idea has since been discredited. Your bumps on your skull are not in any way related to the size of the brain area underneath, but that idea that different parts of your brain control different functions does seem to be supported by research. And in fact, in the 1850s, Paul Broca was able to examine how localized brain damage was related to specific changes in language. So people that have strokes in the frontal lobe of the brain tend to lose the ability to produce speech, whereas people that have strokes towards the back part of the brain in an area called Wernicke's area tend to lose the ability to understand or comprehend language. So a lot of research has identified these specific functions of different brain areas.